Dear listeners, welcome to another exciting episode of the Africa Learning Together series. I am Jacqueline Jerry-Folotia, and I am the Senior Foundational Learning Expert at ADEA, your host for this podcast. Today's podcast is being recorded from Kigali, Rwanda, and we are excited that we are hosting, together with our partners, the Foundational Learning Exchange. And because of that, we're having our podcast in person, and we're super excited about that. So today's podcast is focusing on finding a sustainable pathway out of Africa's foundational learning crisis. And we're going to explore some sustainable ways to accelerate the reversal of the learning crisis, sustain and scale changes, and build solid foundations for future learning.
That's good.
We have a special guest today, and our guest is Benjamin Piper, the Director of the Global Education from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks so much.
It's wonderful to have you here.
It's good to see you again.
It's always wonderful to interact with you. You have such great insights when it comes to education. So thank you so much for making the time to be here.
Pleasure.
So African countries, a lot of African countries are implementing a lot of initiatives around foundational learning, be they, the teaching at the right level or structured pedagogy. But everybody, all of these countries are implementing all of these to improve, learning outcomes in foundational learning. So first question for you, what makes a successful foundational learning initiative, and what pointers should countries and partners focus on to determine what can be successfully and sustainably, keyword sustainably, scaled?
Yeah, I think it's exciting to be here at Flex to learn more from several countries that are working on this issue. I think what I read last, 30 plus countries represented here and 20 plus ministries, which is really great progress on the emphasis that countries and the continent is making on this particular issue. So I would actually say the number one thing that has worked in these highly successful large-scale programs is the emphasis and prioritization on learning.
Right.
Learning doesn't happen by accident.
Right.
Learning happens and learning improves if and when governments decide to prioritize and decide to really make an emphasis on what needs to change and what teachers need to do differently and what the system needs to do. So point number one, I'm a technical person, but point number one is a political decision that governments need to make. And many of them have already made.
Right.
We're going to do foundational learning. But I think what's exciting in several of the countries that are represented here at Flex is it's not just saying, yes, foundational learning is important enough to do, but yes, foundational learning is important enough to prioritize.
Right.
To actually spend my political capital, to spend my energy, to make sure that it's trickling down the system, that this actually does matter.
Right.
And there are specific things that need to change. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think the highly effective large-scale foundational learning programs are ones, unsurprisingly, that had very good learning materials. So it is important as countries are deciding to invest in a foundational learning program to make sure that the materials that kids are using and teachers are teaching from are evidence-based and as high quality as possible. What's exciting, though, is that on the continent, there is an increasing evidence, a science of how to develop high-quality learning materials that link actually between what teachers do and what learners do. And that so that on a daily basis, the learner has engaging, exciting, interactive materials that get them excited about learning both literacy and numeracy and social-emotional skills, and for the teachers that they have materials that help them do the complicated task of teaching these skills. And I think one of the things that some evidence has shown is that it's not just teaching materials and learning materials separately, that these things are integrating. In fact, there was a learning at scale study of 8 highly effective large-scale programs, most of which were in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that the study showed was the integration. It's that the teacher's materials taught the teacher how to teach this particular lesson. So they weren't left in the dark. They were able to use their skill, yes, but actually had the support they needed to do the complicated thing of blending letter sounds and putting together syllables and retelling stories. So the second thing I would say is high quality learning materials. And the third thing I would say is a support mechanism or structure to the teacher. My experience on the continent is that the average teacher in a rural school has a difficult job,
Right.
but they want to do a good job. This idea that teachers don't care and they're just there for other reasons, I think is really not borne out by what I've seen in the continent. A teacher who's dealing with these children wants to do a good job.
Right.
But it's hard to change the practice. It's hard to say that this foundational learning program, should I really invest the time to teach and to learn a new method? Should I really invest the time to prepare my lesson effectively? Because I've had many other programs that have come and gone. So how do I, as a teacher in a rural school who's busy with other things, how do I decide to actually invest the time and brain power to change my practice?
Right.
And so having instructional support to that teacher, whether it be, the evidence is best actually, for a coaching support system.
Right.
That's somebody who comes into their classroom. I can see you'd be a good coach, Jackie.
Why, thank you, Bez.
I'm a teacher in a rural school.
Right.
Jackie would come. You'd see I'd be nervous because you're there.
Oh.
But you would allay my fears and say, don't worry, Ben. I'm not here to evaluate you. I'm not here to complain about your performance. I'm here to help you.
Right.
And as I watch your lesson, I want to give you some feedback on things you've done well, and then a couple of areas of improvement.
Right.
So I think there's really good evidence that a coaching support system that is professional, it's about instruction,
Right.
and it's about specific things. That as you watch me teach, you don't fall back in the old style of your voice wasn't audible, your handwriting wasn't legible. Those are cop-outs. But you would say, Ben, I noticed when you did the blending activity, you did a good job of bringing the syllables together.
Right.
But when you were doing the read aloud, this happened in a class I saw last week. As you were doing the read aloud, you forgot to have the children read aloud. You read to them,
Right.
but they didn't get a chance to read the story themselves.
Awesome.
So a couple of positives and a couple of areas of growth. Having a supportive instructional relationship between a coach and a teacher is really important to get the signal that this instructional improvement program is important, and also that you do have people around you who you can turn to as you deal with the inevitable challenges of the program. I think a fourth area is kind of the way that I'm trained. I think we're excited now because so many of these foundational learning programs are at large scale, national scale. But one of the risks is that the training, professional development activity that I have that would get me ready for teaching in the classroom isn't really supporting my decision making. It's not really giving me practice on what it looks like. I think too many training programs in general are just, here's some facts about foundational learning. And I think the highly effective programs would be ones where, again, Jackie as the trainer, you would give me an example of what it looks like to do a phonemic awareness, oral letter sound activity out loud. You'd show me what it looks like to practice the letter sounds out loud and verbally. And then before we moved on, myself and the teacher next to me, Nick is over there, we would have an opportunity to practice the same phonemic awareness lesson routine that we saw you do. You did a good job of it, but then we have a model to follow up on, and the training gives me an opportunity to practice. And highly effective programs, training programs, are ones that have a significant time where you get a good model and you have enough time for practice.
Right.
And I think if there's a lot of growth to be made in this area, where far too many large-scale programs in foundational learning are struggling because they didn't actually give the teacher the opportunity to practice the new skill. So anyway, those are four things I think are fundamental to large-scale, highly effective.
Great. So just to recap.
Yes.
Political leadership, commitment,
prioritization.
Number one. Number two, teaching and learning materials.
High quality teaching.
Evidence-based,
science of reading, science of numeracy, high quality.
Number three, coaching. And number four,
yes,
teacher training.
Yeah.
Good quality,
practice-based supportive teacher training where I can feel what it looks like to teach this lesson routine before I leave the training.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So the UNESCO GEM report data shows that 89% of children in sub-Saharan Africa are unable to read and understand simple text by the age of 10.
Yes.
Marking the highest rate of learning poverty globally.
Yes.
From your perspective, what strategic priorities are critical to sustainably reverse this trend? And how can we accelerate progress in foundational learning?
So I think one of the things we really need to encourage everyone to understand is that, yes, the outcomes are dire and the situation is a moral one. It's actually hard. It's morally wrong. The kids and families are investing their resources and time and belief in sending their kids to school and they're not getting learning outcomes. That said, I think there's enough evidence of effective programs that have started in the last few years that we should start talking about some of the successes. There are actually programs that are countries that have decided that this is going to be a priority for me, and I'm going to do, as you said earlier, a structured pedagogy program at scale, or I'm going to try a teaching at the right level program to support it. And they are showing impact. So I think one of the things that needs to change, even in this conference, is for us to talk more about what I can learn from Botswana, what I can learn from Western Cape and South Africa, what I can learn from KPLP in Kenya, what I can learn from the teaching the right level programs in Uganda. What can I learn from what's happening and with Moheb's bilingual reform in Senegal? So one of the things is changing our perception. This is a thing we can do and other countries are currently doing.
Right.
And I think in addition, we need to really build on the fact that there's a change in how we talk about it with ministries and with ministers. And for the ministers in this conference, I'm excited about how some of them have started changing how they talk about it externally. It is no longer we are doing foundational learning because 10-year-olds need to be able to read. And obviously that's important.
Yes.
But if you think about the decision-making of senior leaders, presidents, prime ministers in countries, as well as finance ministers, yes, they care about the 9-year-old, but they're more worried about the youth. They're more worried about unemployment.
Right.
They're more worried about the jobs issues. And I think it's really clear that there are strong relationships between what's happening when children are 10 and what happens as they get into TVET programs, vocational training programs. That so much of what we're struggling with, so, by the way, Jackie, so few TVET, vocational training programs, have any impact. And we're investing all these things to try and make vocational training programs more effective because governments are worried. I want to make sure there's a route into the job market for my young people. When I think it's pretty clear that some of the reason why these programs are failing or struggling is because kids don't have these foundational learning skills.
Yes.
If you remember the Matthew effect, basically there's two figures. Kids at the beginning of grade 1 who struggle to learn their letter sounds. And those who do learn their letter sounds, there's a small gap in grade 1.
Right.
But for the kids who do know their letter sounds in grade 1, the ramp up to be able to learn outcomes is pretty steep.
Right.
And those who don't, they struggle and are behind for a long time. So the gaps that start in grade 1, we have evidence for them when they're in age 10, when they're grade 3, grade 4, age 10. But those same gaps continue through primary and affect secondary. So much of what governments are worried about, the jobs issue, employment, the skills gap, a lot of them start with this one. So linking the power and the potential of foundational learning interventions with those other more politically salient issues is, I think, what I'm starting to see more governments think about.
Right, great. And it's interesting you say that because, I mean, when we talk about foundational learning, like you always hear about the analogy of the house.
Yes.
Right? Like that's the foundation.
Right.
So everything else that we see, the secondary school, the tertiary, that's like, the walls and the roof, but those are not sustained because the foundation is not strong enough. So that's a really, really good point that you make there. And also the point around, let's learn from each other. Let's not reinvent the wheel, right?
This is the wheel.
Yeah, there's so many similarities, that we have across the countries, and yes, some successes as well. And whilst some adaptation may need to take place, but there won't be need for you to start from scratch. There's so much to learn from the other countries. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for those insights. So there has been a lot of narrative around scaling what works, but it seems countries having a bit of a challenge around that, right? So is scaling a tough process? I mean, why is it so difficult for countries to scale up? And is there something, that countries need to be doing that they don't know about or they're not doing right that will enable them to go to scale with their initiatives?
So 2 studies I want to recommend, and then I have, I think, an important view on this. Learning at Scale I mentioned earlier, and Numeracy at Scale.
Right.
These are 2 studies that were about identifying highly effective large-scale programs for literacy and for numeracy.
Right.
And across the similar context to here in Sub-Saharan Africa, we found 12 programs that have big impacts and are at scale. And at least 2 of those that were fully government implemented, didn't even have donor funding at all.
Wow.
So there are examples of what needs to happen to get to scale and to get to scale effectively.
Right.
That said, I think one of the common problems that scaling has is that you start thinking about the numbers and the big points and all the trainings and all that, and we lose the classroom. We lose the instructional focus on what the typical teacher is doing. I had the privilege of getting to go to a lot of countries, and I insist on making sure I spend time in classrooms every time I go. So the last 3 weeks, I've been in 3 different countries. I'm here in Rwanda, going to get to see a classrooms this week. And the classrooms I was in last week had all of what you would want from a highly effective large-scale program. You had political prioritization. You had good instructional materials.
Right.
You had a coaching system where people actually visited classrooms consistently, and then decent, not great, but decent teacher training.
Right.
The elements were there. But the teacher, one of the lessons I saw, had done a very good job. It's actually a multi-grade classroom. So you had the grade 1 and grade 2 in the same class, trying to teach them together. Not an easy task, but he did a good job. It was a male teacher for...
Oh, wow. At foundational level?
Yeah.
Amazing.
So the teacher actually had the lesson plan in front of him. Excellent. The kids had the textbook in front of them. Excellent. He got to the story. This is what I look forward to seeing the most. How are they going to read the story? He starts to read the story, and he says the thing, Jackie, you want them to say, which is, make sure everybody take your finger and track with your finger so you read the story as I read. Because our kids here on the continent are very good at saying words loudly, but not reading.
Right.
So tracking with your finger is a good way for the teacher to see, does this kid actually know where we are? Is he decoding or is he just mimicking? So this teacher said it, but then he didn't follow through. He was having a good conversation with them about the content of the story, but not tracking whether the kids were actually tracking with their finger.
Okay.
So the lesson routine was read the story aloud, track with their finger, ask some questions, and then the kids were to read. So the 2 small mistakes he made was he didn't make sure they were tracking with their finger, so they were just calling the words out. Then he skipped the story for the kids to read. So point is, what's one of the things that could practically happen right now for someone listening to this podcast? We could make sure an at-scale program has a few small things for literacy and numeracy that they emphasize down the system for the coach, for the head teacher, for the teacher. And this program, it could be, make sure when you're doing the phonics program, the kids are actually using the textbook or workbook themselves.
Right.
And numeracy, make sure they're doing the place value things themselves. When it gets to the story, track with their finger as you do the read aloud, and don't skip the step where the kids get to read.
Reading, right.
Each country, each program is slightly different,
right.
But having a small number of classroom-based, instructionally focused things that the system should emphasize and focus on, I think would really make a difference.
Awesome.
So being able to know, now you're working in not 500, 5,000, tens of thousands of schools, but if everybody is tracking, are these kids tracking with their finger, doing these lesson routines, and getting a chance to read aloud in each lesson, and getting feedback on that could go a long way to making sure these programs have big impacts.
Right. So it's really about what is happening in the classroom.
And you can't assume that just because the thing is in a lesson routine and just because the workbook says it, the teacher will
actually being
remember to do it.
Right.
But you also can't say, everything needs to happen in every lesson. There's a small number of specific things to emphasize, and that's the sort of thing that this country could have considered a bigger point of emphasis.
Interesting. Especially the point about numbers. I think that's a lot of what we think about when we think about going to scale, and we forget about what happens
in that classroom. And I always say all that matters is what's happening in the typical rural classroom right now.
Right.
And if you as a government or you as an implementer, whether it's a structured pedagogy or teaching the right level program, if the system doesn't know what's happening in the typical rural classroom right now, it's not going as well as you think.
Yeah.
But having kind of a system that looks into that, and there's technology-enabled ways to do this, coaching-enabled ways to do this. But to be able to say, okay, in the Jackie district, it's going very well.
Right.
But in the Ben district, we actually need to emphasize comprehension. You need to emphasize borrowing as you do your subtraction problems. Whatever the emphasis is, you need to have some system of identifying where the challenges are
Right.
that you can find them quickly and follow up.
Okay, awesome. Interesting. Very interesting. So, COVID-19 pandemic, when the pandemic happened, there was a lot of emphasis then on digital learning and use of IT in education, and everybody had their own way, of implementing, technology to teach. But Africa also needs to build resilient learning systems. So a lot of countries now don't even use technology anymore. Once we got back into the classroom, it was done, right? Once kids got back to school, the technology was put aside, right? So based on the ongoing work in EdTech by the Gates Foundation, how can technology be leveraged to improve foundational learning in contexts where 90% of learners lack internet access at home?
Well, I think that number varies by country. Not 90%, I don't think, is in most countries at this case, at this point anymore. But I would say that the main thing that countries can think about is decide what the purpose of the EdTech or the AI-infused EdTech is.
Right.
And I would encourage people to consider that the focus should be helping kids learn. Because if the focus is helping kids learn, you would do something different than if the focus was having a fancy AI thing that you can show off. And if you're focused on helping kids in poor rural places learn, you would do things differently.
Right.
So we think about things in kind of three main buckets from the EdTech AI. Number one, you want to have EdTech AI supporting children, student-facing interventions. So personalized adaptive learning, practice reading, practice with numeracy. There's a lot of things that we're supporting amongst others. But our main focus is how does this affect the poor and the rural young children?
Right.
And you're testing that in those populations rather than the broader context. Secondly, for teacher-facing, even in contexts where the kids themselves don't have access to the internet at home, their teacher can have some support to their instruction through teacher-facing support systems. So there are some interventions or kind of pilots that are thinking about how do you help teachers lesson plan better. We have a long way to go to make those more effective, Jackie, but I'm really excited. Actually, the foundation will continue to invest in that kind of thing. And then third is how does EdTech AI support system-facing work?
Right.
So there have, for 10 years, Jackie, been interventions that have helped the system identify learning outcomes across provinces, states, regions, depending on your country. We have a new investment with Wadwani AI, which is a globally known AI team that's all about it's in Hindi, helping kids be able to read the story and see if they make mistakes. But the AI behind it will start to identify what are the patterns of mistakes for this individual child, and for the teacher, what are the patterns of mistakes for this individual teacher, and then for the system, what should it say about how do we improve instruction? So some of these things that are going to be the most effective for places without consistent internet access are going to be offline. Again, tools exist for a long time that are kind of student-facing and teacher-facing that allow offline access if a parent has a smartphone or if the teacher has a smartphone.
Right.
So we think that the highly effective large-scale structured pedagogy programs of the future, or teaching the right level programs of the future, will increasingly have EdTech incorporated. But we need to test in the short term on the things that are targeting the poor and the rural in particular, so that as internet access and device availability increases in a few years, these sorts of tools can be improved. So what we think as a philanthropy where it's money that is not taxpayer money, let us, amongst others, pilot, try, assess, but be really focused on whether these things work. And going to my first point, it should be about improving learning.
Right.
But the sad point of anybody who's listening to this who's EdTech invested or thinking about it, a tiny percentage of EdTech programs right now are measuring their impacts on learning. And we need substantial more. We need that to be a standard. That if you're working in EdTech and AI, there has to be at the efficacy level, at the medium scale level, and obviously the large scale level, a task for each of us to measure the impacts of those interventions on learning outcomes. It's not just whether or not your tool can do something interesting. whether or not that's actually used by the typical rural family, the typical rural teacher, and whether or not that has an impact on learning. Impacts on learning are what we're all about.
Right. Interesting. And I think in your explanation, you brought out an important point. I think the individualized aspect that, with technology, when, the child begins to work with it, you're able to then see based specifically for that child what their challenges are and where they need additional support.
And for example, there's one tool that we're working with in India where it's a personalized adaptive learning tool that has shown statistically significant impact. But to make it more likely to scale, what we've done is the partner has integrated that into the lesson. So you're the teacher. This time you're the teacher. You note on your lesson plan that, I've taught today 2-digit subtraction. That's all you have to do. A 2-digit subtraction lesson is linked to the structured pedagogy program that's supported by government. Once you click that you've done that, that then triggers a WhatsApp message to the WhatsApp group, which is between you as the teacher and the parents. It says, today I've taught 2-digit subtraction. How do your children practice this? Recognizing that in the short term, not every child has this, but because it's WhatsApp enabled, it's much more likely to reach the typical parent. The parent then would click on it and would pull up the tool, which would then practice 2-digit subtraction, and then enter into the personalized adaptive learning tool, where I could practice at my level the skills I need to get to. And as long as the parent allows the child to have access to that tool, they will be able to increase their learning. But that's much more likely to happen if the request is coming from the teacher to the kid than just if it's the kid on their own. Please, Mom, can I borrow your phone?
Right. Interesting stuff. Looking forward to hearing and reading more about this the Gates work in EdTech. Yes. Wonderful stuff.
Thanks.
Okay. This is my last question.
Sure.
So I like earlier on the point you made about, yes, we have challenges, but, there's also a lot of positive that is happening in the foundational learning space. So looking into the future, what innovations, partnerships, or policy shifts do you believe are most critical for ensuring all children gain essential literacy, numeracy, and social-emotional skills?
Look, I think point number one is that these countries who have decided to invest in foundational learning programs need to make sure they have all the elements we said at the beginning. And some of them, it's just the first point again. It's about prioritizing this. This cannot be an effective foundational learning program is not going to be your 12th priority in the education system. The sector needs to know that I'm talking as a minister, I'm expecting all of my kids to be able to read by age 9 or numerate by age 10. Some message that comes down, some message that is connected to a large-scale program that you've invested in, and some message that's connected into some accountability structure. So what needs to happen and what needs to be prioritized and what needs to happen next is that sort of technical approach. I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that innovation is about scale.
Right.
Learning how best to work inside of the system so that down 3 layers from the minister and above the teacher, everyone's aware that this is a priority. And what I want you to do is focus on making sure that kids have the practice with the reading, have the time to engage on the computation for the numeracy side, and make sure they're engaging with manipulatives on the numeracy side.
Right.
That message comes down, and learning how to make ministries and government structures more efficient to connect into instruction, that is innovation.
Right.
That's innovation. And so learning how the mid-tier works below the ministry and above the teacher, that's innovation.
Right.
In addition to that, we're really excited about innovations in the EdTech space, how EdTech and AI can be capitalized on, how we can make sure we have enough on numeracy. Even this conversation so far, numeracy comes to mind more as we talk.
Okay.
Just because there's been more investments, more programs, more countries have really scaled up the literacy side than numeracy. But kids need basic skills in numeracy.
They do.
So who's innovating on how to improve foundational numeracy skills at large scale? There have been too many programs that are just literacy and are adding in numeracy later. What does it look like for one teacher? Jackie, again, you're the teacher. Whether or not you're getting support down from the system on a foundational numeracy program, you are teaching numeracy.
Right.
But what's the science of numeracy? What does it take to double learning outcomes? I think that's our goal for that, is to have substantial impacts on the numeracy side. We're really excited about thinking around how do you consider the language aspects to make sure we're capitalizing on the mother tongue on the one hand, but also helping governments in the transition to the second language. There's been a lot of policy disagreement about should we teach in mother tongue, should we teach in the second language, should we teach in the third language. I think there's a lot of innovation that could be done on how do we integrate that, how do we make sure the kids have opportunities to learn in both languages. Because again, as Jackie, teaching grade 2, you probably have a time in your timetable that's local language and another time that's the language of broader communication.
Right.
What does it look like to make that work more efficiently? So anyway, there's a lot more innovation areas, but I think we see our role is supporting all these partners, many of which are here at Flex.
Right.
Talented organizations, very focused governments, and the combination of those two things, being able to build together a science of numeracy, a science of literacy, so that we ultimately have better outcomes. But I think one of the things I would say on the innovation side, it's all about getting better implementation, better large scale, many thousands of those rural teachers who can make that lesson taught better on a consistent basis. It's not easy to do, but I think the task for us and the years to come, and particularly this year, how can we build a science of supporting down from the ministry to the teacher so that there's a greater emphasis on what that individual instruction looks like. We need to grow in that area if we're going to get the impacts we need.
Right. We could go on and on discussing foundational learning. I know how passionate you are about it. But as I said, that was my last question.
Okay.
But I will give you an opportunity to say something maybe that we didn't include in our questions, or just for your final thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think the last thing I'd say is that there are several countries in this meeting that have shown that this is possible. The task for us to learn, I pride myself in getting able to get some ideas from Ghana, suggested to Senegal, get some ideas from Uganda, suggested to Kenya. There are partners on this continent, there are countries on this continent who are learning how to do teaching at the right level, learning how to do structured pedagogy to do that at scale.
Right.
And I think part of what we should be encouraged by is that there's an increasing number of countries and partners who have started to crack this problem. And I think we'll be able to see increasing impacts on learning outcomes and have some good stories. There are some good examples. I'm privileged because I get a lot of data early. I get to see what impacts are coming.
Okay.
There's some good examples. There's a recent impact evaluation report from Ethiopia on not large scale, but highly effective interventions that can be scaled and are working at scale, and being able to see the kind of technical focus of these organizations. It is about focus, simplification, but also connection into what that classroom looks like. So I think the programs that have had that impact, it's kind of like, how do I navigate the military precision that's required to get large-scale program improvement, but link that into the individual teacher who's teaching by themselves. We have some more examples of that. I'm excited to see.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ben, for joining us today.
Thanks to ADEA for this session and the opportunity. I think we're learning from the leadership of this organization, but also the ministries that you represent. It's these governments who are making the decisions to lead. We're excited to be behind and support.
Right. Well, thanks again. It's always a pleasure to have you. And to our listeners, thank you so much for listening in. We hope that, this podcast has been helpful for you. Please keep listening to our podcast. And till the next podcast, please do take care and speak to you next time.
Thank you so much.